afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar, Intelligent Automation for Credit Unions, What, How, and How Much? I'm Brittany Brown with NAFQ Services, and I'll be the moderator for our conversation today with Strategic Resource Management, our preferred partner for vendor cost benchmarking and negotiation services. There are a few quick things I want to call out about the platform. At the bottom of your screen are multiple applications like a survey, contact form, and resources. All sections can open and close, so feel free to move them around and organize your desktop space however you see fit. There will also be time for Q&A at the end of the presentation, so if you have a question for our speaker, please use the Q&A widget, which is located to the left of the slides. Feel free to submit those questions as they come to you. You don't need to wait until the end of the webinar. A copy of today's slide deck and the on-demand recording of this webinar will be emailed to all registrants after the presentation. And now, a little bit about our expert presenter, Jesse McGannon. Jesse is Vice President at Strategic Resource Management, providing advisory services for operational process improvements and technology strategy guidance for financial services products. His technical experience in cross-border payments, faster payments, digital banking, and intelligent automation has been applied in all stages of project delivery, from initial strategy to target state design and on through implementation. So we're really excited to have him with us today. Jesse, welcome to the webinar.
Thanks, Brittany, and thanks for the introduction. As Brittany mentioned, I'm really excited to be here today. We at SRM are very excited about intelligent automation. It's been a hot topic to talk about. Lots of conferences are asking us to speak, and so that's very exciting. And excited to be presenting to all of you today. So to get started, really want to start with why. Why should you be interested in this? Why should your credit union be focused on this? Why is this all important? So wanted to just poll the audience just to get things started here. And the question is, which of the following is your credit union most focused on this year? Is it improving the member experience, reducing operational costs, reducing operational risks, or empowering your staff? I would assume that all four of these are probably top of mind for most of the credit unions, but we're just trying to gather which is number one. What would you say is top of mind for your credit union? So I'll pause for just a few more seconds while people finish up and answer the question. Another 10 seconds here. Okay. So it looks like improving the member experience is number one, which is what I expected that to be, and reducing operational costs being number two, but a pretty big follower behind improving the member experience. So with that in mind, I really just wanted to kind of cover off what I believe to be the value behind intelligent automation. And it's really across all of these areas. So when I think about why intelligent automation is important for credit unions and the value it provides, I think the middle one, reducing cost and risk, is largely what in the past has been the focal point around intelligent automation. But it's not really the way that I think about it. I really think that the value is equally spread across all of these areas. And so in the improving the member experience, I think that you're able, by automating processes and implementing chatbots and the technologies we're talking about today, you're able to better and more effectively serve your members. In reducing cost and risk, the reason I've combined them here is because generally the same use cases accomplishes both at the same time, and we'll get into some examples of that in the next slide. And finally, empowering your staff to perform their jobs better. I think that this is certainly an issue these days, especially with as high as turnover is and as difficult it is to train people in new areas. I think that making things easier on your staff is one of the true values that you get out of intelligent automation. So I want to just talk through, there's a dozen ideas on the slide here, but really just dive a little deeper into each of those areas I just discussed. So on improving the member experience, I think one of the big use cases here is account opening. And so I recently spoke with a credit union which would send their sales reps out in the field. This is a credit union that represents an airline. And so they would go to the airports, they would go to sign up employees of the airline, and they would generate a lot of excitement with the employee. They get them to open an account, but then in the back office processes that it took to open an account ended up taking 3 to 4 days, and then they would mail them a welcome kit asking them to go fund their account. And that proved to be really challenging because over those 3 to 4 days, the excitement about opening that credit union account would fade, and a lot of the times they had an issue where those accounts would then never end up getting funded and then eventually going dormant. And so, by improving the speed to execute processes, you can really improve that member experience and make sure that you don't, face those same challenges. I think another example here is in the call center. I think we've all had I had one recently. We've all had the experience of being on the phone with a call center, asking to do what seems like a relatively simple task. And then they put us on hold for 5+ minutes. We don't know what they're doing. We don't know why it's taking so long. Maybe it's because they don't know how to do it and they're asking a friend to help. Maybe it's because they just have, 6 or what seems like a simple task to us actually involves 5 or 6 applications in the background. And so, meanwhile, the member is just sitting there on hold while the customer service rep is executing whatever task. And so it's not a great customer experience. And so by automating some of these processes, what we can do is really make things easier for both the support staff as well as the member who's being helped. And finally, I think the other area here is chatbots. I think that I've heard some skepticism about chatbots. I've heard a lot of, my members like the human interaction. They don't want to talk to a robot. But really, I think the research in this area says quite the opposite, especially with the younger generation, with millennials and the upcoming Gen Z. These people don't like to be on the phone. They don't like talking to people that they don't know, and they prefer interacting with the chatbot. And so, by implementing customer-facing chatbots, you can really help that member experience. You can help answer those easy questions, and you can reduce the number of calls coming into your call center. So the next area is around reducing costs and risks. This has historically been, reducing costs has historically been the main objective of robotic process automation. And so, this has historically been the reason to automate. However, more and more we're seeing the primary goal is being to reduce risk. An example that I've encountered in my career was one of the major credit card networks brought us in because they had this outage where they couldn't, clear and settle in Europe for about 3 days, which is obviously a huge problem. And when we did a forensic investigation, what we found was that the root cause of that outage was actually a very simple configuration change. It was, one of their banks was trying to change the bin configuration, and they fat-fingered one of the inputs. And as a result of that, there were all these ripple effects that ultimately led to crashing their clearing and settlement engine for 3 days. And so, with manual processes comes manual error. And a lot of the times we're seeing, to complete a payment, you have to key in the 16-digit PAN in 5 or 6 different places. And these call center reps have a notepad open so they can copy and paste. And so when you automate these processes, you're not only reducing the cost, but you're also reducing the risk of someone miskeying an important number. And finally, the third area that I want to talk about is empowering your staff. So I recently attended the NAFQ CEO conference down in Florida. And the biggest thing that stuck out to me through all the conversations I had with, credit union CEOs was how big of a challenge they viewed staffing to be. Of course, unemployment is at an all-time low right now. Turnover is really high, especially within call centers, and the skill sets required to succeed in a digital world are changing. Especially for credit unions, which are in growth mode, these challenges are going to become exacerbated over the coming months and years. And so through automation, you can mitigate these challenges in a few ways. First of all, you can reduce the training cycle. Call centers typically take 2 months before they let people on the phone. You have to learn all the processes that someone could be calling about. You spend a lot of time shadowing other customer service reps. And so it can be quite costly to train a new representative. I think that applies to both call centers and your branch staff. Allowing the credit union to grow without having to hire more people, I think, is one of the biggest advantages of automation. So if you're going through a growth mode, what maybe you have 5 people doing now, and if you were to grow twofold, you need to have 10 people. Well, if you can automate a lot of their work, you can continue to have just those 5 people and not need to find more talented staff. And really what you're doing is you allow your existing staff to be redeployed in many different ways. And so, if you can automate 80% of their workload, then you can reduce their time on their existing things by 20% and allow them to do those higher value type roles and contribute to the credit union in more powerful ways. So I've talked a little bit about how the technologies can be used. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about what these technologies are. So really there's 3 different technologies we're focused on today. And so starting in the middle, we have robotic process automation. What robotic process automation is used for is really it handles structured data in a really powerful way. And so anytime where you have a process that is done the same way, following a specific set of rules, then robotic process automation is a great use case to automate that. And so if A and B are true, then you need to perform actions C, D, and E. That's what robotic process automation handles and can automate. Its limitations are unstructured information. And so that's where it can be powerful to pair robotic process automation with the technologies on the left and the right. And so on the left, we have OCR, which is optical character recognition. This is a technology that's been around for a long time. I would guess that most of you out there are probably already using OCR in one way or another. But this is simply taking an image that has potential handwriting on that image and then converting those handwritten characters to text. So examples here would be a new account application or a loan application. If you still have paper-based applications and those have not been digitized yet, you can scan in the paper applications. OCR will then convert all of that to data, and then that data can serve as the input to your robotic process automation that you've automated. And then another example here could be people paying their bills, people paying their credit card statement. And so if they mail in a check, you can just scan the check. You can digitize all of the handwritten fields on the check, and then again, that serves as your input to automatically then apply the checks to the accounts. And finally, on the right side, we have intelligent software. So this is machine learning and AI. This is where you're simulating human cognition processes to solve business problems. And so a couple of different examples here. One way which machine learning can be paired with robotic process automation is actually to make it simpler to automate that RPA. And so, typically when we help companies implement RPA, the general rule of thumb is, let's say, for example, there's 20 different ways that a loan application could be processed. But the vast majority of that is, by ways, 1 and 2. And so maybe 2 of the possible permutations cover 80% of the scenarios. And so we always recommend, you don't focus on fully automating your process. Automate 80% of your process, and then for the other 20% of scenarios, bounce that out and let a human handle it. And so the way that these RPA technologies are now using machine learning is for all of those where it bounces out and you're letting a human handle it, the software will still monitor what that human's doing. It'll look at the keystrokes, it'll look at what's being clicked, and then over time it can actually teach itself to automate that process. So rather than having to program the robot for a process, once you get this going, you can actually have the technology improve over time and be able to handle a greater amount of scenarios over time. And so that rather than having to, have developers programming the bots, they program themselves effectively. And then the other intelligent software that we're focused on today is chatbots and voice bots. And so, this is where you can deploy these both internally and externally. Internally meaning you have your own staff interacting with the chatbot, and then externally meaning that you have your members interfacing with chatbots and voice bots. And so these are the technologies we're focused on. And the last thing I want to talk about in this section of the presentation is just debunking a few myths. So over the past few months, as I've been out talking to a lot of credit unions about this and gathering, both what their concerns are or what has held them up from implementing this technology already, we have a few different, items that I've heard consistently, and I just want to give my perspective on those items which I perceive to be myths. So one, that these technologies are still risky and unproven. This to me, I think, is just a natural reaction. People tend to be resistant to change. People tend to be skeptical of things they don't understand. And so, in reality, these aren't new technologies. I mean, RPA has actually been around since the turn of the century. There's tens of thousands of proven use cases in production, primarily in financial services. I think that the biggest users of RPA today are Chase, Citibank, Wells Fargo, and Bank of America. Those four big banks have huge teams dedicated to RPA. And I think that this technology is the biggest change that's happened is it's gotten easier to implement. And so over the past few years, that's really been the focus of these vendors has been to make it easier and easier to implement, to remove the barriers to entry. And so now I think the technology has gotten to a point where you don't need to have huge scale to see the value. Which brings me to the next myth, which is it costs too much to implement. I think a lot of people are very focused on their IT technology spend these days, and they just perceive that any spend is going to be, a huge expenditure. And with RPA, I think what makes it unique is that because it's easy to implement, it's simple to implement, you can get involved in this space for as little as a 50 to 100K investment. And, we'll talk a little bit later about the return on investment is great for these use cases. But I think that, it's a myth that there's going to be a huge upfront expenditure to enter this space. And similarly, on the third item here, it costs too much to support. So typically we see ongoing costs as being only 10 to 20% of the original investment per year. Another myth is what we hear a lot is, hey, we don't want to do this yet because our processes are garbage, right? We know that our processes are clunky. They're not Lean Six Sigma. And so we want to focus on fixing the process first, and then we'll consider automation. And we actually don't think that's just a good use of time or effort. And so, when you let's say you have this really clunky process that takes way too long today. Well, when humans are doing that, it may be super inefficient. But when you have a robot executing that same inefficient process, the inefficiencies are really minimized. And so typically what we find is that a lot of the times you can re-engineer these processes as they are today before spending a lot of time and money automating them. The fifth one is always a fun one to talk about. So these technologies are eliminating jobs. That is not usually the case. Most of the times when we see this, what we see is that there's, firms or credit unions and banks are redeploying those same staff in more meaningful ways. And so not only are you not eliminating the staff, but you're putting them in positions where they can think more critically. They can focus on better serving the customers. If you automate, 80% of the things they're focused on today, then they can serve members on the remaining 20% much better, and you can then redeploy them to take on special projects and use their brains more as opposed to doing these very robotic processes that they're executing today. And finally, we sometimes hear that credit unions think they're too small for this. They don't have the economies of scale to have a sound business case for this technology. And again, we don't think that's true. There's a lot of credit unions today who are already leveraging RPA and chatbots with impressive results. And really, I'm of the opinion that there is not a minimum size threshold in order to see the value in these technologies. So that ends the first section of this, and really the next, the remaining part of my presentation, I'm going to focus on diving deeper into some of the benefits and the use cases. So I want to again start with a poll question, and so want to know which of the following use cases are you most interested in for your credit union? Loan operations, merger and acquisition, data migration, chatbots and voice bots, account opening, or as a knowledge management solution. I'm gonna touch on all 5 of these, but again, it'll help me cater my presentation if I can better understand what's top of mind for you guys, which of these 5 examples jumps out as something that your credit union is interested in. So let me pause for another 15 to 20 seconds while everyone answers this. Okay, I'm going to give it 5 more seconds. All right. Interesting. Nobody said M&A. Okay, well, I will minimize my talk about that part of it. Looks like we're pretty spread out across the other 4, though. Loan operations, chatbots and voice bots, account opening, and knowledge management. Great. So first area I want to talk about is the lending space. The lending space tends to get a lot of attention and tends to be a really good use case for RPA. And the reason for that is, as I talk to COOs and people within the operations organization at credit unions, it tends to be one of the most labor-intensive parts. There's the most operational processes. Typically, it's the loan operations is often the biggest team within an operations staff because there's just a lot of regulations in this space, and there's just a lot of manual processes to process these loans. And so a few ways that we can use RPA in this space and AI, first of all, on the upfront space with the loan decisioning. You can use AI to support loan approvals, to increase the number of loans which you're auto-approving, or even further up in the spectrum, which you're pre-approving before a marketing campaign, so that you don't have to have the manual decisioning and the meeting with the underwriters and the interviews and all those aspects of it. And then once you've already approved a loan, I think that's actually where the most labor-intensive manual aspects come in that are ripe for automation. So a lot of times you still have these lengthy handwritten forms that you need to enter in. A lot of times there's not a single loan system you need to update, but you have several different pieces of software and different systems that need to be updated with these loans to board them. And then, finally, once they're already boarded, you have the you have the servicing of these. And so as people are making payments and checking their balances and reviewing transactions, those are things that are easily handled by chatbots or voice bots. So going to the next area, I'm going to speed through this because it was the lowest on the polls. but merger integration. And so, I think that I've recently met with a few credit unions who are going through mergers and integrations, or mergers and acquisitions, that is. They're now in the integration stage, and they say, we don't have time to focus on this because everyone's focused on the merger. And one of the most challenging parts about a merger is aligning your operational processes. And so you're already going through the work of training new staff on new processes. You've got to either pick, do you want to take the old process from from company A, or the new process from credit union B? And so you're already going through so much change. It can actually be the easiest time and the most effective time to implement robotic process automation. And then, the two I've got highlighted in the top right are related to the data mapping. And so, I think I recently talked to a credit union that had a great success story here. They were, I don't recall exactly who it was, but it was, a Jack Henry bank merging with a Fiserv bank. And one of those vendors had quoted them, $90,000 in order to migrate the data from one core to the other. And so what they did, because they weren't really happy with that and they thought they might be able to do it themselves, they implemented an RPA solution to basically simulate manually merging all that data over, which obviously if you were to have your people do it, that would be a painful exercise. But what they were able to do is they were able to, they took a day and a half of setup to program these robots on how to manually move all of the account data from one to the other. But then they let it run over the weekend, and about, in between Saturday and Sunday, probably less time, it was actually able to manually move over all of that data. And I say manually, but it was a robot that was manually moving over all that data, and they were able to effectively do that data transfer for under $20,000, as opposed to the $90,000 that the core vendor had quoted them. And so next I'll go on to chatbots and voice bots. And first I want to explain the difference between these two and what I mean by a chatbot and a voice bot. So a chatbot is going to be anything that you're interacting with the bot via written text. So, this could be via, it's the same as if you're text messaging somebody. So it's typed out text, and, the interface is going to look like, any sort of chat screen. If you guys use Skype internally, or SameTime, or any of these other, sort of chat technologies, that's what a chatbot is. Whereas a voice bot is going to be, audibly speaking to somebody. And so, think of a voice bot as a more intelligent IVR. And so, someone you can speak to using normal language as opposed to, press 1 for this or press 2 for this. And so, chatbots we see being implemented both internally and externally. Internally, what you're going to do is implement these to serve as a support for your staff. So this could be your branch staff, this could be your call center staff, and what you're doing is, it's basically going to link to your knowledge management repository. I've still, and on all the different institutions I've worked with, I've never seen knowledge management implemented in what I would call a good way. I don't know if there is a good way. It's, even if you have, organized SharePoint, or you have a tool specifically designed for knowledge management, it's always impossible to find what you're looking for. But these chatbot technologies have become really good at, being able to say, hey, what's the policy around this? Or is this member I'm talking to right now eligible to do this transaction they're trying to do? Or what are the procedures for this? And so it enables your staff to better serve the customer and the member while, being on the phone with them. They don't need to go put them on hold to then go, phone a friend to figure out how to do something. They can just chat real time with the chatbot. So that's the internal use case. And the external use case is really going to be, implementing it on your website or through your mobile app. So, we hear that the number one reason people call centers for credit unions is really simple things like, what is my balance? And so if they could just chat, and largely it's because they don't know how to self-service themselves. But if they're on the website and then, maybe they can't find what they're looking for, they can then just go to the chat bot and deflect calls from the call center. And again, voice bots are going to be most often used as an enhanced IVR. So rather than press 1 to get to this, press 2 to get to this, press 3 to get to this, which is very frustrating and annoying, you can just implement a voice bot to say, what are you calling in about today? And then it can then decipher what the person's calling about and get them to the right department. So just to talk through a credit union chat bot case study, this was a credit union who had recently launched a new online banking platform. The call center became overwhelmed because customers were calling in. They couldn't figure out how to do things, or they couldn't log in correctly, or whatever it may be. Agents were struggling for the right information. They weren't adequately trained on this new banking platform. And so what that led is that the experts who did know were strained by all of these agents reaching out to them for help. And so, meanwhile, they're putting the member on hold. They're calling the expert. They may have to wait on hold themselves to get to the expert. And it was quite a mess. And so what they did is they implemented a chat bot to become the first level of information. This is an internal-facing chat bot. So, that your level 1 care agents are interfacing with the chat bot to ask them questions. And they had a dramatic effect in improving the effectiveness of the first level support agents, freeing up those experts, and they saw a 50% reduction in requests being escalated to second level support. And so I thought this was a good case study to share of how the chatbots can be deployed internally in order to support your call center. And so, just to wrap things up, just want to talk a little bit about why we think this should be a priority for credit unions and why now is the right time. I mentioned earlier that these technologies have come a long way. And, I would say that the greatest area they've grown in the past 3 to 5 years has been not in what the technologies are capable of doing. I think that, that has been static for a little while. But the ease of implementation is really what's has really improved a lot. And so what it enables is that it's a lower barrier to entry. You can immediately start recognizing those cost savings. It's easy to implement, and these projects are largely business-led. We always recommend that you start by automating existing processes as they are. But as you start to play with this technology, as you begin to understand the capabilities of the technology, it often enables the business to rethink the way that they go about their business. I mentioned one case is the loan decisioning, using AI to decision your loans. You can get more into pre-approvals in that space where you are making targeted offers to people that are eligible to really push to get more loans on your books. And overall, there's a few good examples about real benefits that my colleagues and I have seen achieved through this. But the ROI is typically in the range of 6 to 1. We see a lot of reduction in errors, and really that the way that we view this is that it is a no-brainer. It is a minimal investment and a huge cost-saving opportunity. Cost-saving opportunity that does not impact your members in any sort of negative way. And really, most of the time, we think that this is a positive impact to the member experience. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you all for listening and bearing with me for half an hour. And at this point, I'd like to see if we have any questions.
Thanks, Jesse. Yeah, let's open it up to Q&A from the audience. And if you haven't already done so, please enter your question into the Q&A widget on the left. I have a couple here for you. Starting out, where should we focus first in intelligent automation to get the greatest ROI in the least amount of time? It's
a great question. I think that every every institution is going to be different when it comes to this, because I think the easiest way to kind of to get to that is to really look at where you have the most fat in your organization. I guess fat may not be the right word there, but if you have a lot of people doing a certain area, so loan operations is a good example. If your loan operations team is huge, that means that you're going to get the most bang for your buck when you implement this. And really the way that when we partner with credit unions to help them identify the right use cases, what we're really looking at is twofold. One is what's the frequency of this process? Obviously you're going to get better return if you are you're automating a process that happens 30 times a day versus a process that happens 2 times a day. And so you look at the frequency, and then you also look at how much time does it take to execute this process? If people today are executing it in 5 minutes, maybe not a great use case for automation. But if it takes someone 3 hours to complete a process, and we think that we can get the time down to 10 minutes by automating a portion of that process, that's really where you find it. But I do think that there's a lot more use cases out there than the ones I talked about today. The ones I talked about today, loan operations, account opening, and call center support, are the areas that we're finding to be the biggest return on investments for credit unions.
Okay, great. So another question for you. We're struggling with staff turnover in our call center. How can intelligent automation help?
Sure. So, I think I touched on that a bit earlier. So I think there's really a few ways there. Is that, one, you make it easier to be that call center representative, right? So by automating their processes that they're doing, I've shadowed it a few call center reps before, and it's sometimes mind-boggling what they need to do to complete simple transactions, right? So what the call center that I was in, their staff would regularly keep Notepad open. They would write down all of the information that the member was saying to them, including their account numbers and things like that. And they would first write it down in Notepad, and then they would go open all these different applications that they needed to log into their accounts for. And so, they would spend a good 45 seconds just getting logged in, and then they would need to make the same kind of updates in multiple places. And so, it takes a long time to train someone to do that, which makes, your turnover is always, the challenge of turnover is always exacerbated by how difficult it is to train new people. And so the easier you can make it to execute processes, the easier it is to train new people, the less people you need to have. And then that way, the investment in hiring somebody can be reduced because you don't have them spending 2 months in training before they get on the floor.
Okay, great. Another question for you. What functional areas do you see leading and managing the automation project? So some examples that this attendee gives are the business area that the project will impact, the IT department, or a project management group.
Can you read the question one more time? I just want to make sure I understood it.
Absolutely, yeah. So he asks, what functional areas do you see leading and managing the automation projects? And some examples that he provided are the business area that the project will impact, the IT department, or a project management group. So which of those would likely lead and manage an automation project?
Yep, absolutely. So typically we would say that it'll have some impact to all three. I would say the number one is going to be the business area, because they're the ones who are going to be experts on the process today. And so, what these implementations look like is it's going to be, to a detailed level, mapping out the existing process. And then, you're typically going to have your project management group involved just to help manage the process. You can also, outsource that. That's part of our service office. That service offering at SRMs will serve as the project manager, and then they'll be interfacing with the vendors and the developers here. IT is going to be involved because it is a new piece of software, and they may need to stand up a single server in order to help, a single server for these robots to live on. But typically, it's not a big IT project. I would say of those three areas you mentioned, IT is maybe going to involve the least amount of the resources, unless, of course, the project management group is part of your IT organization. But no, it certainly involves the business up front. It's really, the business involvement is really just to map out the current state processes. Unfortunately, the biggest obstacle sometimes is that there's very little documentation about how the current process works. And so if your credit union already has well-documented processes, then it's going to minimize the impact there. But really that is going to be, each person's role. The project management team will run the project. The business team will help explain how the current process, and it's not even really the business team. I would say it's the operations team that's going to have to explain how the current process is executed today. And then the IT team is going to need to do a little bit of work just to set up the infrastructure and also provide the credentials. So, these robots get credentials to a system just like any human would have, right? And so they're going to have their own username and password on the system.
Right. Great. Thanks. All right. One last question for you. How long does it typically take to complete an automation project?
Sure. I didn't mention that at all earlier, which I meant to. And so an automation project, we see for your very first one, we typically say 8 to 10 weeks because you've got to do a little bit of work up front to, get that server stood up and get the robot access to credentials. And so for the very first use case, typically you always start with a pilot. So you pick one or two use cases that you're going to pilot, and that pilot typically takes 8 to 10 weeks to go live. Once you've done it once, to add on additional use cases is pretty easy. And so we typically see, to add on additional processes that you're automating can be done in 2 to 3 weeks.